From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel, a Potomac Watch podcast.
Welcome to All Things with Kim Strassel, a Wall Street Journal opinion podcast. And I am joined this week with former CIA officer and current talented radio and television host, Buck Sexton. Buck, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Kim, honored to be with you. Thank you so much for having me.
This is going to be fun. Normally, I have a theme for these, but as you are a man able to talk about anything and everything, and as we have just about closed out 2024, hallelujah, I thought we'd use this show to talk about some of the highlights and lowlights of the past year, and maybe even make a few observations about the coming near future. So I'm going to start and put you on the spot. Winners and losers of the year. If you had to choose a couple of winners for this year politically, who would they be?
I mean, the obvious answer is the answer that everyone would have to give. I mean, Donald Trump had the most amazing comeback in certainly my lifetime in politics. And in many ways, I think the most sweeping win a Republican has had in my adult lifetime. I may be younger than a few of your audience listeners. But I mean, it was incredible for Donald Trump to do what he did, to be indicted 4 times with felonies, 2 state cases, 2 federal cases, to survive 2 assassination attempts, 1 with a bullet to the ear, to be called by most of the Democrat media some version of Hitler, a fascist, and a threat to democracy, all of the above, and to win so convincingly that the Democrats have just gone off onto the side and been whimpering ever since the election. I mean, that's absolutely remarkable. I think you have to throw J.D. Vance in there as well. To go from a first-term senator to being the vice president on this ticket is pretty amazing. I was an advocate for J.D. very early on in this regard. I said, I think about 6 months before on my radio show, I said, I think it's going to be J.D. Vance. So very happy with that. So you wanted winners. I mean, those are the biggest, clearest winners out there. There's others as well. Dave McCormick with a big win over the Democrat Casey in Pennsylvania. I'm trying to just do like an around the horn here. I mean, who am I leaving off? Basically, a great year for Republicans not named Carrie Lake, and in terms of the elections. And yeah, I mean, for Democrats, I mean, losers galore. But the biggest thing is I just think the Democrat Party ethos, overriding narrative, it's in tatters. I've never seen it so, I don't know what the word would be. I've been saying it's in remission. Maybe that's too kind. I think it is. They've got nothing right now. And I don't even know who they think their leader is or will be. I don't think they know. I think that they have a party that there's a very loud 20% of the Democrats. Maybe it's more like 40 or 50%, but a very loud group that demands things that are not popular with the national electorate. And I think they're going to continue to demand them. And so the obvious choice would be for them to try to go more toward the center with a blue dog Democrat, whatever you want to call it. Basically a Democrat in a reddish state or a red state who pretends not to be a Democrat for election time. But I don't know if they'll be able to do that. I don't know if that'll happen for them in a primary. So, I mean, basically, the forces of good have triumphed over the forces of evil, at least for a time, and it's a great time to be an American. Well, that was a wonderful and concise explanation of some of the biggest winners. I'm going to throw a few more of my own in there, maybe less obvious. I would say Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, and John Thune, the incoming leader of the Senate, only because I think both the House and the Senate Republican caucuses needed some new faces, needed some new direction there. And I think there's at least opportunity for both of them. Harder for Johnson because that majority is so narrow. Elon Musk, I would say, although I wouldn't say that he's a winner just because he's now in the orbit of the most influential man in the country. But why I would say Elon Musk is a winner is because of the reasons that he got into politics, that he suddenly saw in recent years. Here's this billionaire. He's got all this money, and he decided to engage, but he decided to engage for the right reasons, meaning he saw all this massive government dysfunction via his interactions because of SpaceX. He saw these growing threats to free speech, and he decided to get on board and to go make a meaningful change in politics. Can I piggyback off your Elon? I think that's a critical one. I mean, I think that the dynamic duo of Trump and Elon, with all due respect to JD, who I think is fantastic, but to have the most powerful politician in the world with the most powerful CEO in the world and the single wealthiest person on the planet and in all history. That's pretty powerful stuff, just to lean on the word a bit going into 2025. And you mentioned what happened to Elon. I think it's worth everyone knowing, because this ties into what happened in this last election, I think, very directly. Elon was quite clear and has been quite clear publicly that everything you said is true, but the really triggering or inciting moment for his red pill transformation was, and he's spoken about this, the transing, if you will, of his son, and how he feels like the system was all set up to indoctrinate his son, that his son should be trans, is a girl, all this stuff. And he says that he no longer has a son. He now has a daughter, or a son who thinks he's a daughter, or whatever. And that, I believe the quote that Elon said is that once they did that, it meant war. And I think that that's very powerful. I think it's very personal for him. And he has seen, I mean, the left went basically insane. I have no sympathy for Democrats who are upset about this election whatsoever. They lied about Joe Biden's cognitive state. He has dementia. He's an old man. It was absurd to run him again. It was honestly irresponsible to run him the first time. And Kamala Harris is the most incapable and unimpressive politician to run for national office on any major party ticket, certainly in the last 24 years. So I think they deserve the ignominious end of 2024 that Democrats are feeling right now. And I think that Elon Musk should be feeling like one of his rockets flying high in the sky. It's fantastic.
By the way, on that Kamala Harris point, that was a point that everyone in the party understood right up until the moment Joe Biden got out. And then suddenly they decided to try to remake her as this political genius and juggernaut. And I never really got how they thought they could pull that off. We're going to take a quick break. When we get back, more with Buck Sexton. Welcome back. I'm Kim Strassel, here with All Things, and this week we have Buck Sexton, radio talk show host. I'm going to add one more winner just because I think it piggybacks too off of the Elon Musk point, which is I kind of feel, and this is more broad, general, it's not about a person who is winning, but I sort of thought this was a banner year for the reemergence of free speech, in that one of the benefits of having guys like Elon Musk up there and just speak the things that many average people feel about the trans issue, etc., is I feel as though it's emboldened Americans again to sort of push back against these elite cultural and speech police that had erected all these new structures around the country. So we're beginning to see, this was the year, we're beginning to see the dismantling of some of these diversity and equity programs, which were about dividing us along race again, and beginning to see the dismantling of some of these ESG programs, which were all about getting businesses, mowing them into doing things that weren't good for shareholders or products or workers or the economy, but rather were about liberal agendas. So that would be the other one I would add for a winner of this year. Okay, losers.
Wait, I have one more thing on that, because you're making such good points that I get excited about your point, and then I want to keep going with it.
Go.
That's really, in large part, what you just described is actually, I think, in large part because of Elon Musk. I know a lot of people say, well, I'm not on X, and not everyone's on X, Twitter, same thing. So what difference can it really make in the grand scheme of things? It's almost like the internet ombudsman. It creates an ecosystem for real-time sharing of information and outing of regime disinformation, such that the rest of the news cycle, where if you get your news at night from one of the big channels or wherever you go, one of the big websites out there, you have to be aware of the fact that if you run some story that's total bull, X is going to tear you up. And everyone's going to know about it. And every other station and every other show and channel, everything else is in a position to dunk on you now. And they weren't used to that. I mean, quite the opposite. In 2020, obviously, the Rubicon was crossed, not only with the suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop story, but then the de-interneting of Parler by Amazon Web Servers. I mean, the things that they did, the totalitarian approach to speech that we saw, and the efficacy of it. I mean, let's remember, from a collection of different platforms was terrifying. And Elon broke their stranglehold. And I think that's why what you said is true, which is that this was a big year for it.
It's such a good point because we were headed down such a scary road. Don't forget that when Biden was first elected, one of their first ideas was to have this new disinformation oversight board. I mean, this was an actual idea that was being debated in Washington. Remarkable stuff. And I think that became much harder to do right after Elon Musk bought Twitter and people began to push back and realize the danger of those words disinformation, misinformation. It was all about a narrative one side wanted to push. Losers, you obviously talk a bit about the big one, the Democratic Party, Kamala Harris, Joe Biden. They're kind of the big ones. I wonder if we could drill down, though, into some of the losers. Like, for example, I think a piece of that was a big loser, at least I hope, is a message that is taken away by progressives. Lawfare was a big loser this year in that they threw everything they had at Donald Trump. And they did get 34 felony convictions in that New York case. And you know what America said? We're kind of sick of all of this. We're tuning it out. Do you think that message is going to get across?
Well, it was critical that it happened the way it did because lawfare is the end of the system, actually. And that's not an exaggeration. That's people talk about, end of democracy and all this in the context of Trump. But what they don't talk about is what does it mean if you have the normalization of prosecuting your chief political rival or garbage? I mean, the New York one, I'm glad they went with that first, just because that was the most absurd, contorted. No person of good faith and any intellectual capability thought that was a 34 count felony case. I mean, thought it was really any case at all. I mean, there was no crime, there was no harm, there was no nothing. It was insane. It was really a delusion. And I'm glad that was first because people could see how the whole thing was just a scam to get Trump. But you look at the other cases as well, and they all have fallen by the wayside now. And if they had been successful, I think, unfortunately, it would have been a huge encouragement to more of this going forward. I don't think that this is defeated necessarily as a tactic, but I do think that because of the blowback of, well, Trump won, guys, so do you really want to do this again? Do you think raiding Mar-a-Lago was really a good idea? I think that that's critical for the future of the country. I actually believe, I know whenever someone says this, it's usually incredibly a partisan comment. I actually think it's a nonpartisan thing to think that lawfare's defeat means that we continue to live in a country where elections have some meaning and some integrity. So, yeah, I think that was absolutely critical. And for a long time, I thought that the trials were probably going nowhere, or at least politically weren't going to have the intent that they wanted them to. So it wasn't a surprise. But the fact that they went forward with this after all the Russia collusion stuff and the Mueller probes and everything, I really think that these people it's almost like the Democrat Party was in some kind of a political schizophrenic frenzy. And now they're just lying on the ground exhausted after sort of shrieking at the moon and the wall and everything for the last, I don't know how many years. I got to do the math in my head, last 8 years.
Pretty much every Democrat, much of the media, even a couple of Republicans are now worried that certain Trump appointees will come in and do it themselves. The word of the day is retribution. Do you see that happening?
No, I don't. But I also think that the people that believe the system should be used against Donald Trump in an election year are in just no place to lecture anybody about anything. Now, that doesn't mean that I would be okay with Kash Patel coming in and saying, you know what? Adam Schiff is a jerk. Let's lock him up, right? I mean, no, of course not. We don't want that, and that's not going to happen. And I know they like to pretend that they're the victims now, but I mean, this is a classic tactic, I don't know, I could say of the communists, of the Marxists, right? They do something terrible, and when they start to lose or when it goes against them, they claim the other side is doing the terrible thing to them, right? So I have really no time, or I have no patience for this argument that, oh, what are the Trump appointees going to do? We'll see. And I say that knowing some of them very well on a personal level. I've known them for many years, a bunch of them. I know they're good people, and also know, though, that there's no immunity for official misconduct, lying under oath, the kind of malfeasance that they have been going after Trump people with for a long time. If that malfeasance is found to have been conducted by Democrats, yeah, I mean, I think that there should be prosecutions. I just don't want what Alvin Bragg did, but I think if you find that there were clear acts that broke the law under the Biden administration. I mean, look at Hunter Biden. The guy was breaking the law like it was going out of style for years and years. We all know it. And they all lied about that. So there's a lot of stuff that I think should be looked at and will be looked at. So when they say retribution, I don't know. Do they mean accountability? Do they mean justice? We can play this game all day.
The words that you use that I think are so important are broke the law. and I think that's the real problem with lawfare is, yes, you can pull up any law and say, oh, well, you violated this law or that law. But if it's a stretch, it probably shouldn't be brought. And that's the thing that I hope everybody keeps in mind is because I have, plenty of relatives. Every time they get mad about something that someone did in politics, they say, well, we should throw them in jail. We can't criminalize political offenses. We got to stick to the law. And I am happy to hear most of the Trump people coming in talking about the rule of law. We're going to take one more quick break.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel, a Potomac Watch podcast.
Welcome back. Kim Strassel here with Buck Sexton. Another loser I have, and I'd like to get your thoughts on it just because we broadly work in this area, if not this particular definition. But the mainstream media strikes me big losers this year, not just because they went all in for one candidate who lost in the end. And in all of my years, I don't think I've ever seen anything so nakedly partisan. We obviously have talked many years about bias in the media, but this was outright cheerleading for one team, working almost as a branch of a political party. So there was that part of it that I think is losing, but also they became somewhat irrelevant toward the end of this election, maybe most of it.
I actually think it's worse than that, Kim, because this isn't it's on both sides thing. I like to be very clear about that. You work at the Wall Street Journal. I work in conservative talk radio. I was not saying if Kamala Harris wins this election, the country is over. They were saying that. And when I say they, I mean CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, their columnists. They were all saying this about Trump. And it's just hysteria. And it's irrational. I don't know if you know this. Hopefully you tune into the Clay and Buck show sometimes, Kim.
I do.
As I hope your audience will. I became an avid Morning Joe watcher just because it was this fascinating. It's like the chief catastrophist at the country club, Joe Scarborough's like, the whole world's going to end if this guy actually wins the election. He's a fascist. He's a Nazi. This was insane. It was some kind of weird performance art they were doing every morning. I'd watch this and say, how do they air this? How do they air this and think that they're serious people? Donald Trump is a Nazi? My co-host Clay just got back from Israel. This will come as a shock to no one listening to your show. The Israelis love Donald Trump. I don't think they would love a Nazi, right? This is crazy stuff that was being said. They lit their credibility on fire. I have no respect for these people. I think they are overpaid. I think they are dishonest. I think they are babies. And I think they've gotten away with being really bad actors, really malevolent. And I mean, little Stephanopoulos paying his big fine now, or, his company pays the big fine for the defamation for what he said. And the way, the Zoolander guy, Mr. Handsome from ABC News and the debate, he was horrible. And Margaret Brennan was horrible from CBS. These people, the fact that their credibility is in tatters and their audiences are running to find something else is like balance being restored to the force. This is the way it should be because what they've done is disgraceful. So I'm happy to see MSNBC in collapse. I'm happy to see CNN's ratings in free fall. And the New York Times is kind of some woke rag that nobody should pay any attention to. They should all subscribe to the Wall Street Journal.
Thank you. I actually have made the argument, I keep saying it again and again, that the kind of conventional wisdom is that the media was in there to help Kamala Harris, was this huge aid, this unpaid advertisement, as it were. I make the argument Democrats should be angry at the media because I think that the media enabled this loss in part by being so disconnected what was really happening out there on the ground that they allowed them to live in a la-la land where they kept thinking they actually were going to win this election when so much of the country was angry. And that's what happens when the Fourth Estate doesn't do its job. It's meant to be tough on everyone in government on all sides and give them a clear picture of what's happening. And when they don't, bad things happen. And that's just one of them.
Yeah, you'll probably be happy to know that the conservative base that I speak to on a regular basis, sometimes they get very angry at the Wall Street Journal for just reporting things that they don't necessarily want to hear or agree with. So,
I hear from those people a lot, believe me.
But I can tell you this, on some of these other channels, that never happens because the mandate is not to, even on and I'm talking front page, by the way. I'm not talking about editorial columnists. Front page, the mandate at the New York Times and the Washington Post is not to report the news, it's to help Democrats.
One more loser I'm going to throw out here, and then I'm going to get your advice on something. But one more loser, again, a little bit more out of left field, not a person or a party. But I also think that one of the big losers this year, intriguingly, is the climate industry. If you just step back, I think this is thanks to overreach by the Biden administration, high energy prices, people realizing they don't really want to buy EVs, insecurity in the grid, a growing understanding of the economic and also national security consequences of adopting this kind of strategy. I don't know. What do you think? There's a lot of groups that have spent billions of dollars to turn this into an industry that can't be turned back, but I think that's shifting.
This is insane. The whole thing is absurd. No one actually wants to do any of the things that they say need to be done to save the planet because it would ruin the economy of the entire world. It's a religious belief for people who think they're too smart for religion. It has overtaken people. It's this cult ideology. It's wrong over and over again. They keep believing it because something that Democrats, one of their great trade-offs, or one of the things that's so fun about being a Democrat, and I'm friends with more than a few, so I have some experience with this, is the ability to just rack up unearned virtue, because you subscribe to the things you're supposed to, you say you believe in these things, so you're a better, smarter person, and you can look down on other people. And I think that actually becomes an addictive feedback loop for a lot of the Democrat Party faithful, that they think that, well, I believe in climate change, therefore I'm a good person. And you say, well, what are you actually doing about this? And what changes to your life would you want to make? Well, none, of course, right? They want to live in big houses and fly private if they can, but certainly fly whatever they want otherwise. I think that the climate stuff will come back, unfortunately, because it's kind of a zombie idea for people. It gives them purpose who otherwise lack purpose. And it's great because it's global. It fits into so many things, but it's also quite sad because it's completely pointless. Like, the climate is changing. It will always be changing. We're decarbonizing naturally. Energy sources are becoming cleaner. Nuclear is going to get better. Like, there's all these things that are happening, and these people chaining themselves to a coal plant somewhere because they don't want to have the electricity they need for their electric cars. It doesn't make any sense. But, politics has really become just mass emotional mobilization for a lot of the country. Maybe almost half the country.
Well, speaking of that, your last quick words of wisdom I just want to get, as we look at this Republican majority, there's lots of big plans, lots of euphoria. You and I have done this enough to know that that's always the case after you win an election. What would you warn them to be careful of? What would be something that you would tell them to just keep their eye on as they go into the hard work that's coming in 2025?
The big thing is going to be the deportation issue and the border. I think it's in some ways make or break for the administration, certainly on a domestic policy front. And this is going to get tough. I think this is where the media rallies, the sort of anti-Trump media rallies around this issue, because they're going to frame it as this ties into xenophobia, racism, all the usual isms and things that they'll say about it. I think if they focus, though, and they show people that they really are, especially in the first 6 months, just deporting criminals, felons, rapists, murderers, because there's tens of thousands of them we know are here in the country already. Hundreds of thousands, depending on, what you're talking about in terms of the scale of the crimes, the severity of the crimes. So I think that's really important. And also just Trump's going to have to keep the egos in check because he's got a lot of, I don't mean his own. Trump's ego can do whatever it wants. Like, that bear is loose. Like, there's no dealing with that. But I'm talking about the team around him. He's got a lot of alpha dogs, and they have to, in different ways, play. I'm talking about within the White House and some of the cabinet picks, and they're going to have to play somewhat nice with each other to get the agenda done. And I think that that's a place that I worry could be a little bit of a stumbling block. But mostly it's just go max out on the immigration agenda right away, and you'll create so much momentum for everything else that everything else will become easy. Don't delay, don't dither, and don't let your enemies determine what your strategy will be.
And I'd add, stay united. That's going to be key with these narrow majorities. Thank you for those words of wisdom. Buck, thank you for joining us this week. We want to thank our listeners. If you like the show, please hit the subscribe button. And if you'd like to write to us, you can at pwpodcast@wsj.com.